I took it from the book that you thought that the United States would be the pivotal actor in the 21st century. To some extent, of course, that's been true in the 20th century as well. But I wondered how you saw it playing out that role over what's the next, as you say, the next 100 years.
Well, I mean, we have to begin with some basic facts. The American economy is larger than the next four economies combined. If you take Japan, China, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and you combine them, they're not quite as large as the United States. We speak of the United States as deindustrializing. American industrial output in 2007 was larger than the combined industrial output of China and Japan. The United States is the world's second largest producer of natural gas, the third largest oil producer, ahead of Kuwait, for example. When you put these economic facts on the table, you get a sense of the enormity, a qualitative difference between the U.S. economy and all other economies. The American economy constitutes between 25 and 30% of the world's economic activity. Let me add to this one final fact. Japan's population density is 365 people per square kilometer. Germany's is about 260 people. The United States is 34, not counting Alaska. If you think about the possibility of upside, if you will, and you think of the three inputs into an economy, land, labor, and capital, and you take a look at the land availability in the United States as opposed to Germany or Japan or China for that matter, if you take a look at the ability of the United States to manage immigrants very efficiently because they can go somewhere far away from other people, and then if you think about the fact that the United States Navy controls all of the oceans in the world, something that no other state in the history of humanity has ever achieved, and you consider what the United States could potentially do with that military power, not that it will choose to do so, I suspect, but what it could, and you combine the picture together, then you start thinking about the hurdles that other countries would have to leap through to begin to challenge American power. All power is relative. There's the power you have and the power the challenger has. So we talk about China, it would have to grow, it's about tripled its size in the past 20 years. It would now have to grow 5 times, and the United States not at all, for China to equal the United States economically, and then would have to start worrying about military growth. So in other words, the actual barriers between the United States and other countries, whether you like the United States or not, whether you think it's just or anything else, the sheer fundamentals of it, when you step back and stop the rhetoric and just take a look at it, it is very hard for another country to challenge the United States in all of the dimensions in which it's powerful.
I understand from that you say that China won't challenge the United States over that period, but I wondered how you would see China's development over the medium term in political and economic respects.
Well, I have to benchmark that as well, and I do a lot of benchmarking, comparing. If you recall, in the 1980s, we all knew that Japan was going to overwhelm the United States and the rest of the world because it was so productive, so creative, and so on and so forth. We have gone through 3 phases of Asian post-war economic development. The first was the Japanese surge that ended in the 1990s, and which the West noticed ending in 1995. It was a 5-year lag. The second was the East Asian meltdown of 1997. And now we are looking at China. The characteristics of Asian economies are fairly similar. They are based on not having a market economy in capital. Capital is distributed for political reasons, for social reasons, for kairetsu reasons, what have you. Japan in 1990 had, in the industrial world, the lowest rate of return on capital in the world, which means they sold a lot of products, they didn't make a lot of money. My Uncle Louis had a dress business. He sold dresses for $9. It cost him $10 to make it, but he figured he'd make it up in volume. In many cases, in Asian economies, you have very narrow profit margins, and the rate of growth does not reflect the health of the economy. In fact, as in the case of Uncle Louis, a very good Christmas killed him. And you really have to take that very seriously, because we tend to focus on growth rates because some of the disciplines of non-Asian economies will mean that a high growth rate will mean profit, that there is a connection between the two. And one of the things we learned in Japan is there wasn't. They had an extraordinarily high growth rate. It hollowed out their banking system, leading to the crisis of 1991 and froze up the country. China has that problem, and I'll define it in these terms. When Japan went south, as we say in the States, the ratio of non-performing loans, in other words, loans that you're going to stiff the bank on, to GDP was 17%. When Korea and Taiwan ran into trouble, they were at about 23%. If you believe Chinese official government figures, the number in China of non-performing loans to GDP is about 40%. And that's an optimistic number. So this is an economy that has reached a climax stage that's built into the kind of capital allocation you do in Asia. One of the characteristics of reaching this phase is everybody is gaga over you because you are selling more and more and growing faster and faster. Well, of course, you have a debt-driven economy. You're trying to cover your cash flow. So you sell. You sell for cash flow, not for profitability. And every month you're going to grow. And every month everybody's going to say, marvelous, what a great country. We knew that Japan was in deep trouble when the Japanese started investing in Pebble Beach and Rockefeller Center, everything not in Japan. And we asked a very stupid question. If Japan is such a wonderful investment that anybody be a fool not to invest in, why are the Japanese not investing there? Why are they buying anything outside of Japan? And there was a reason, which is that the insiders knew. They knew the problems they had. In 95, 96, you had a similar massive outflow of capital from Taiwan and South Korea. And again, the media took this to be a sign of enormous strength, whereas it was really a harbinger of terrific problems. You now have a massive outflow of capital from China, buying mines, buying condos, buying anything that's not in China, which, if the prognostications from China enthusiasts in the West were true, would be suicidally stupid behavior. Why do I want to own real estate in Australia when I can be in an economy that's going to grow by 15% forever? Well, the answer is growth and profitability are two different things, and they know better. Remember this about China, which is different from all these other countries. China has a population of 1.3 billion people. 1.1 billion of these people live at a standard of living of Nigeria. I went to Pudong and had one of those wonderful dinners that costs your next year's earnings. And I asked, what one of the waitresses was making. And she was making $60, $70 a month. And I went to the place she lived. I had somebody take me there. I didn't go to the place she lived. And she was living in a concrete building, unheated. There was cold water, no hot water, and the privies were outside for reasons I don't understand. And she regarded this as a marvelous improvement over what she had before in the farms. So 1.1 billion of these people live in the most extraordinary poverty. Of the 200 million people living in what we recognize as the China that's exciting, this China is not part of China. These factories don't sell in China. You can't sell those products to people who are at a subsistence level agricultural life. These are extensions of the West. These factories are part of the American economy, the Australian economy, the European economy, but mostly the American economy. And if the American economy stops buying because we have a recession or we increase our savings rate, then what happens is that the rate of growth of exports falls and their ability to cover their debts fall. And what you're seeing in China right now is the government scrambling badly to use what are actually quite limited reserves. $2 trillion isn't what it used to be. To simultaneously try to get demand going in the interior of China, which you can't do at about $600 billion. That's just not enough for 1.1 trillion people. And secondly, to cover the banks that are in very deep trouble because of cash flow issues. And thirdly, make sure they're putting enough into the American economy so the American economy doesn't slip any deeper into recession and stop buying G.I. Joes from China and everything else that they sell. And so I would argue that China has a double whammy on it. It has reached a stage that Japan and Southeast and Eastern Asia reached at a certain point. And it reached at about 10 years cycle. So there was Japan hit, East Asia hit, China's hitting now. The Japanese collapse came from an American recession in 91, 92, because they were exporting to us and we stopped buying. A very similar phenomenon occurred in the 1990s, although it was somewhat more complex, having not to do with the United States. But this recession is not particularly hurting the United States. It's clobbering the Chinese. If this hadn't happened, they still would have had their non-performing loan problem, the very low rate of return on capital problem, and the fact that 1.1 billion Chinese are furious at being left out and of having their land stolen. Because one of the ways that you get loans in China is through land. And when a company needs more loans, it needs more land, and the company official goes to his cousin, who is the assistant governor of the region, and they take land. And if you read the newspapers, you will read about land riots and so on going on in China. This isn't happening just because mean people are doing things. This is how you're stabilizing the banking system. About 2 months ago, a bomb went off in PSB headquarters in Shanghai. PSB is the FBI of China. And somebody blew up the building. Now, when you ask the question, if China is doing so well, why are they so obsessed with security? Why are they violating human rights? Why are they doing all these things? Two answers are possible. They're incredibly wicked people who don't appreciate the fact that they could live like Australians if they just stopped it, or the Chinese know a great deal more about China than Westerners, and they know they're in trouble. Which is a very long way of saying that it was a very important question, because one of the great underlying myths of the past years is that the Chinese economic miracle, and it was a miracle, is eternal, and that it can go on ad infinitum and will go on ad infinitum. And what I've tried to lay out is the reasons, the single most important question, of why it's not going on, and it certainly can't go on for another 30 years.
I think one of the things that many people would find surprising about the book, and I suppose I was certainly surprised, is the central role that you give to two particular countries, Turkey and Poland, over the next 100 years, countries that haven't, of course, up to date played that kind of role in world affairs. I wonder if you'd like to explain how and why you think that's going to happen.
Well, in the first place, if in 1900 I told you all the British and French empires would collapse, a third world country with a 50% literacy rate would dominate the world, the United States, I mean, and the center of gravity of international industrialism would be Northeast Asia, they'd carry me out in a padded suit and give me medication. Nothing is a worse guide to the future than common sense. Because common sense basically tells you that what we have here is pretty much what we're going to have in the future. And that's just not how history works. And if you take a look at the 20th century, and we were sitting here in 1985, and I were to say to you, the Soviet Union will collapse in 5 years, you'd laugh, of course. History is full of what appears to be breathtaking changes. So let me explain what I think is going to happen. I see China not collapsing. I see China weakening, becoming a less of a force, and the People's Liberation Army is an internal security force. It's not going to attack anyone. I see Russia going through a period of resurgence and decline, and I see Eurasia sinking down into a degree of malaise, if you will, at the very least. It will be the periphery of Eurasia that will create the great powers. And of the great powers, you mentioned two, I see three great powers emerging. Or more precisely, two of them, they've already emerged. Firstly, the great Asian power is not China. It's Japan. Japan has a much larger economy than China. It has much fewer weaknesses. It doesn't have 3/4 of its population in dire poverty. It's not growing particularly well, but it certainly has the largest navy in Asia. When the North Koreans were launching their missiles, it was Aegis destroyers from the Japanese Defense Forces that came in there ready to shoot down the missiles. The Japanese army is larger than the British army. Now, Japan is a country that wishes not to be noticed. And please pay no attention to me. I'm harmless and have no intentions. And that is truly how they feel. They don't want to have intentions. But China is now trying to get the navy that Japan already has. And so when I look at the great Asian powers and I forget the newspapers, Japan leaps out immediately. That would be one power. The second power that I'm looking at is Turkey. Turkey now is the 17th largest economy in the world. It is larger than Saudi Arabia. It has an army and a military capability that is probably the best in Europe, with the possible exception of Great Britain. They could beat the Germans in an afternoon and the French in an hour if they showed up. So when we take a look at the Turks, it is not an accident that President Obama, when he finished his tour of Europe, was quite unsatisfactory tour of Europe, finished off in Turkey. And the message to the Europeans was very simply, you know, I really enjoyed eating with you guys and talking to you guys and being told no by you guys. Now I'm going to go to a real ally that has real military power, is negotiating with the Syrians, is working in Iraq, has a very close line to the Iranians, and the Iranians are quite frightened of them, is negotiating with the Armenians, stabilizing the situation in the Caucasus, which is a serious power. Whenever the Islamic world in the past 1,000 years has had a unification, it has been under a Turkic power, and for 500 years it was under the Ottoman rule. And when it was under the Ottoman rule, the Arabs took a subordinate position, and the Turks created an order. Now, for the past 100 years, Turkey has been in a very strange position that it was never in before, because it was surrounded by first the Europeans, and then the Russians and the Americans. But the Americans are leaving, the Russians are not coming back, and the British are busy doing other things. And suddenly Turkey is unfolding its wings. And there's no one in the region when you talk to who doesn't, in every discussion of politics, doesn't in the second session build up what do the Turks want. The third country is Poland, which is the strangest choice, but let me explain. Apart from the fact that in the 17th century Poland was a great European power. The United States is watching the rise of Russia. It's using the window of opportunity to invade Georgia, to transform the Ukrainian government, to put pressure on the Baltics, and so on. The Germans are unable to act because Germany imports 50% of its natural gas from Russia. And last January, if you recall, the Russians turned off the flow of natural gas, kind of to say, hi, how are you, Happy New Year. And if you think we won't do it, think again. Chancellor Merkel is being very cautious with the Germans. It is not in the American interest to see European industrialism and technology unite with Russian natural resources. This is not what U.S. grand strategy really wants to see happen. If the United States wishes to block or contain Russia this to go around, there's only one place to do it. That's Poland. And that's not because of Polish history or anything, it's geography. That is the border. Now, the United States has already decided to put a ballistic missile defense system into Poland, and it really doesn't have to be in Poland, and probably doesn't work, and that's not why the U.S. is doing it. It is putting a stake in the ground to say that this is a special relationship of the United States, and we reserve the right to put anything we want in there. What's far more important and not reported in the press is the fact that the United States has been selling F-16s to the Poles, training their special forces, and doing all sorts of other lovely things that Americans like to do. The Russians, of course, are going bananas because they understand exactly what we're about to do, and they want to stop it. Now, when you wind up a strategic asset to the United States, something very special happens, good and bad. And for that, I invite you to think about South Korea. In 1950, South Korea was a nation of rice farmers, not even very good rice farmers. Torn by occupation by the Japanese, about to go through a horrible war. Today, South Korea is a massive industrial power, and you drive Korean cars, many of you, and watch Korean television sets. And if I had said to you in 1950 that South Korea is going to be a great industrial power in 50 years, you would have laughed. Why did it become a great industrial power? It became a great industrial power because the only real superpower, the United States, needed it to be one. It needed a very vibrant and viable South Korea for American strategic reasons. And therefore, there was technology transfer, there was capital transfer, and the Koreans had access to the American market on a very favorable basis. This was not the only example. Israel is another, where Israel, which in 1950 should not have become a major military or economic power, did. And the U.S. relationship was critical to that. Same with Japan, same with Germany. So there is a pattern and a knowable process of what happens when the United States badly needs a country to be successful. The United States very badly needs Poland to be very successful because it sits on the North German plain blocking the Russians. From the American point of view, making Poland a great power is cheap and easy compared to other things that could happen. From Poland's point of view, it is sitting between its two favorite countries, Germany and Russia, and they're talking to each other again, which, if you're Polish, means nothing but trouble. In other words, the U.S. needs Poland and it has Poland where it wants it. Poland needs the United States and has the United States where it wants it. And I see a dynamic kicking off that we've seen several times since 1950 that will culminate in a great power, great regional power in Poland.